The abrupt cooling of the US-Iran crisis this week did not emerge from a single telephone conversation or an unexpected shift of perspective in a strategy chamber. It arose from a network of discreet diplomacy, unofficial channels, and the uncomfortable arithmetic of authority that shapes contemporary global affairs. The reports present us a narrative of discussions, not a stage of public confrontation. The audience learns that Russia and Gulf Arab nations performed a crucial function. But to comprehend why and how this occurred, we must follow the strands from the edges of strategic maneuvering to the heart of policymaking in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, and Riyadh. We must question who profits, who shoulders the burden, and what the genuine dangers are if this delicate ceasefire dissipates. The week started with a recognizable pattern: a turbulent stalemate between Washington and Tehran over the fragments of a prolonged war of rhetoric, penalties, and concealed dangers. The United States had consistently intensified its stance, implementing fresh sanctions, escalating public alerts, and indicating that any error would be answered with substantial repercussions. Tehran, for its share, confronted internal pressures to demonstrate strength and resist what it terms external compulsion, while also requiring economic respite and a route back to some manner of global acceptance. In that pressure cooker, a conventional set of instruments, sanctions, armed presence, pressure initiatives in the Persian Gulf, and diplomatic exclusion has long been the established arsenal. But this week's cooling was not the outcome of another wave of penalties or a broadcast presidential statement. It was created from confidential diplomacy, the sort of discreet effort that frequently produces outcomes the audience never witnesses until it's delayed or too apparent to disregard. To comprehend the importance, we must initially chart the actors and the motivations at the bargaining table. On the American flank, the White House confronts a challenging matrix of internal politics, partnership administration, and strategic concerns that are never cleanly coordinated. The President's counselors, the National Security Council, the defense establishment in the Pentagon, and the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, and associates, each possess their own viewpoints on danger and benefit. Policymaking in Washington is seldom a direct line from the Oval Office to the executive apparatus. It is a bargaining among rival clusters of authority. Representatives evaluate public messaging against private guarantees, political resources against national benefit computations, and immediate crisis handling against longer-term strategic architecture. In this framework, any shift toward cooling, particularly with Iran, a nation long portrayed as a primary opponent, indicates a restructuring of danger appetites and a reassessment of what achievement resembles in the brief and extended term. Tehran's reasoning is similarly complex. Iran is a nation that has persistently attempted to discourage what it views as existential dangers: economic exclusion, armed encirclement, and boundaries established by external authorities. Its governance must stabilize two overarching requirements: protecting the regime's continuation and sustaining enough global space to obtain economic respite, political credibility, and territorial sway. The Iranian governance has long contended that its strength is demonstrated not by capitulation, but by continued persistence in the presence of multifaceted pressure. That position converts into a strategic inclination for negotiating advantage that can be wielded through a blend of force and compromise. The inquiry for Tehran is whether any perceived advantage from a temporary reduction of friction will convert into concrete economic or strategic respite, or whether it will activate another sequence of retaliatory actions once the immediate appearance fades. Then, there are the external power mediators whose sway shifts the battlefield. Russia's function in this week's progress is not coincidental. Moscow has long nurtured relationships with both Washington and Tehran, presenting itself as a facilitator, or at minimum, a stabilizing influence in locations where great powers' interests overlap. Its stance in Syria, Ukraine, and wider Middle East diplomacy has regularly been about securing a position at the discussion table and obtaining strategic allowances from various flanks. By discreetly enabling channels and presenting a structure where both flanks can preserve dignity, Russia diminishes the likelihood of an unintended miscalculation that could trigger escalation. Russia also transmits a wider indication. It remains a participant in the worldwide equilibrium of authority and a designer of territorial results even as the United States reassesses its own obligations. The Gulf Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates deliver a parallel regionally concentrated set of concerns. Their concerns are intricate and complex. Preserving security against perceived Iranian sway, maintaining the steadiness of energy sectors, and supporting their own political credibility at home by displaying strength internationally. In recent periods, Gulf capitals have followed a more sophisticated diplomatic approach, utilizing energy advantage, economic investment, and territorial diplomacy to handle competition with Tehran, while preventing direct confrontation that could endanger worldwide oil movements and territorial steadiness. Their participation in confidential diplomacy with both flanks mirrors our ambition to handle the outcomes of increased U.S. pressure on Iran, while guaranteeing they maintain sway over the account of security in the Gulf and further. From the perspective of the sanctions structure and the dollar's authority, the week's rotation matters. Sanctions are blunt devices. They are intended to penalize, discourage, and compel. But they also establish dependencies, produce accidental outcomes, and require constant reassessment. The dollar-centered financial structure is both an instrument and a barrier. It can force conduct through the danger of economic suffering, but it can also trigger hardship for regular people and ripple across worldwide sectors. For policymakers in Tehran and Washington, the wager is whether a break in escalation can be utilized to design an escape from the constricting noose of sanctions without surrendering fundamental national concerns. If the break becomes a maintained enhancement, it could release channels that had appeared permanently sealed, restricted re-entry into global financial networks, more foreseeable oil sectors, and an opening for territorial cooperation on security frameworks that diminish the motivations for miscalculation. To witness how this week's developments materialized, we must separate what is public positioning from what was discreetly bargained. On the public flank, both Washington and Tehran performed their functions with declarations highlighting the gravity of the dangers and the significance of maintaining channels accessible. But the genuine effort, what permitted a cooling to establish routes, probably occurred behind sealed entrances in unofficial discussions that covered nights and time regions. These discussions would have demanded reciprocal guarantees that neither flank would advance toward a hasty attack or an irreparable escalation while discussions persisted, that restricted, confirmable actions could be executed to relieve pressure in methods that would not be interpreted as vulnerability by internal extremists, and that a believable route toward future discussions could be established, even if initially limited. Why presently? And why this arrangement of participants in the wider arc of U.S.-Iran relationships? Several merging pressures established an instance where cooling became more than a tactical break. The United States confronts a transforming worldwide atmosphere in which the traditional understanding that Washington can control due to superior armed strength is progressively challenged by strategic rivals and territorial participants who have acquired to interpret and answer to American willingness for danger. This is not about vulnerability in Washington, so much as an acknowledgement that strength alone cannot secure favorable results, particularly when local, territorial, and global dynamics establish a threshold on what singular action can accomplish. For Iran, the reasoning has to measure the internal economic suffering and the global exclusion against the perceived requirement of remaining steadfast in the presence of external pressure. If a break can provide a quantifiable enhancement in daily existence, social steadiness, and economic outlook without surrendering strategic resources or undermining core non-negotiables, the governance in Tehran has motive to view it as sensible action. What does cooling actually resemble on the terrain? In functional terms, it can assume several shapes. The initial is a suspension to aggressive armed activities in delicate waters and airspace, diminishing the danger of a misreading that could ignite a wider conflict. The second is a progressive loosening of certain economic pressures, permitting a more operational exchange in financial assistance, energy sectors, and humanitarian commerce, albeit within the limitations of existing sanction structures. Third is the restoration or preservation of lines of political and diplomatic interaction, whether through unofficial diplomacy, public diplomacy cushioning, or selective participation with global participants who can assist monitor and confirm obligations. Each of these actions carries a confirmation responsibility. Both flanks must be capable to exhibit that the other is satisfying its commitments, and that the break is not simply a break in designation only, but a believable action toward longer-term stabilization. The participation of Gulf nations in Russia, however unclear, has a strategic reasoning beyond the immediate crisis. For Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, permitting a cooling diminishes the danger of destabilizing spillovers into a wider territorial conflict while maintaining their own advantage in designing the territorial arrangement. It also provides them a position at the discussion table with greater believability, guaranteeing that any agreement mirrors territorial circumstances and anxieties. In Moscow's situation, it strengthens its function as a crucial negotiator, capable of shaping results where US and Iranian concerns collide. It also indicates to Washington that Russia can design results without necessarily supplying direct armed assistance. An significant message in a reality where Moscow attempts to position itself as a disciplined multi-vector authority rather than a purely adversarial influence. The net outcome is a reassessment of authority dynamics that acknowledges the intricacy of contemporary diplomacy. Various capitals, each with their own boundaries and strategic objectives, can guide the direction of a crisis without depending solely on one state's forceful arsenal. For the United States, the cooling suggests a reassessed danger reasoning. The White House and its national security structure must harmonize the ambition to press Tehran on core matters, nuclear openness, ballistic missile progressions, territorial security frameworks, with the functional requirement to avert a sudden escalation that could endanger American staff, associates, and the steadiness of worldwide sectors. The choice to pursue and receive a cooling track is as much about danger handling as it is about policy accomplishment. It acknowledges that certain components of competition with Iran, such as cyber intelligence gathering and sway operations, will continue beyond any temporary arrangement. It also recognizes that the internal political atmosphere in the United States, with its pressures from various groups, may establish a premium on demonstrating that the United States can responsibly handle conflict and prevent large-scale confrontation without relinquishing core strategic purposes. From a wider viewpoint, the crisis and its abrupt softening brightens several persistent dynamics in global politics. Initially, the authority of casual diplomacy remains powerful. The reality that a crisis could cool through unofficial discussions highlights how statecraft frequently functions in the darkness of public accounts. Secondly, great powers do not bargain in a void. Their selections are designed by internal politics, partnership dynamics, and the immediate business of governance. Thirdly, territorial participants are no longer satisfied with being inactive observers in great authority chess. Gulf nations, for example, now function with a greater awareness of diplomatic refinement and independence, utilizing their distinctive position in the energy economy to shape results. But we must also stay conscious of boundaries and dangers. A cooling that rests on confidential agreements is naturally delicate. The lack of a formal, transparent structure for confirmation can encourage misreading, internal opposition, or a replay of old complaints if trust deteriorates. The danger is not only that the break dissolves into renewed friction, but that a future miscalculation by any one participant could activate a fresh crisis with less space to navigate. The wiser strategy would be to pair any reciprocal control with a transparent mechanism for ongoing conversation, confidence-building actions, and a progressive route toward confirmable safeguards that address core anxieties on both flanks. The inquiry, then, is whether the participants will maintain this strategy long enough to convert a break into meaningful advancement in sectors that have repeatedly ignited friction, nuclear protections, ballistic missile activity, counterterrorism collaboration, and territorial security structure. What transforms for regular people in the nations participating? The most immediate concrete outcome may be a steadier horizon for territorial sectors and cross-border trade. Oil values sensitive to geopolitical impacts might settle into a firmer range if the fear of abrupt disruption diminishes. Investors who had withdrawn from the territory may re-enter with a measured awareness of confidence, though the danger premium could stay high, given the instability that still accompanies Iranian and wider Middle East danger. At the same instance, sanctions remain a powerful economic policy device with genuine outcomes for Iranian businesses. The break could unlock restricted channels to reach foreign banks, retrieve profits, and import fundamental goods. But any enhancement is probable to be gradual and subject to the threshold established by remaining sanctions and political danger. For American stakeholders, a steadier tone in the Gulf and in Tehran diminishes the danger to the supply network and energy security, while potentially releasing political space for Washington to follow a wider multi-layered approach that includes diplomacy with other territorial participants and continued competition with strategic opponents. This week's progress is also a reminder that the wider geopolitical terrain is not a binary contest between two nations. It is a multipolar atmosphere where the actions of one nation are interpreted, processed, and sometimes redirected by an arrangement of participants. Russia, Gulf capitals, European partners, and territorial associates, each contributing to the outcome in methods that seldom receive front-page consideration. The immediate inquiry is not whether the United States will modify its stance toward Iran, but how it will stabilize its insistence on deterrence with its readiness to receive a handled, confirmable cooling. The response will rely on a series of actions from the micro, how confirmation will be performed, and what represents compliance to the macro, how this cooling influences the strategic reasoning of all participating, including China, which observes every action in the territory for indications of opportunity or danger. The potential outcomes of this break, if it persists, are diverse. On one side, it could establish the method for a more persistent and believable process of diplomacy. The nuclear document, long the centerpiece of US-Iran friction, might become subject to a fresh structure that invites gradual allowances, more substantial inspections, and perhaps a staged relieving of limitations in exchange for reciprocal openness. On the territorial front, a less unstable Persian Gulf could prompt nations to follow functional security collaboration, diminish the danger of miscalculations at sea or in the atmosphere, and establish a space for conversation on related matters from cybersecurity to energy passages. On the other side, the break could be uncertain. If internal groups interpret cooling as a vulnerability or a betrayal of core national concerns, pressure to return to extremist stances could strengthen. If the confirmation structure is vulnerable or detailed disputes emerge over what represents compliance, trust can deteriorate and the opening for a more comprehensive arrangement could seal or stay ajar but limited. The finest result would be a progressive, transparent process that constructs confidence over duration, not a rushed ceremonial settlement that dissolves as soon as the wind transforms. There is a wider lesson for observers who follow the interplay between authority and control. The crisis and its discreet resolution emphasize the circumstance that the United States cannot singularly dictate results in a territory where local participants, territorial authorities, and worldwide rivals all possess a stake. The same is accurate for Iran. It cannot obtain its security objectives solely through force or the danger of escalation. A lasting settlement will demand a believable plan for confirmation, believable motivations for compliance, and believable assurances that the other flank will honor and maintain the arrangement. It will demand patience, a readiness to withstand political discomfort at home, an acknowledgement that diplomacy is an extended game, one in which short-term victories matter, but lasting resolution demands maintained effort, carefully measured actions, and dependable associates. If this week's cooling demonstrates lasting, what should we observe for following? The initial indicators will be how apparent the actions are that indicate a genuine obligation to control, slow monitored reductions in aggressive deployments, more foreseeable signaling from both capitals, and a concrete pace of respite in sanction structures that are not politically explosive but suggestive of a reciprocal conviction that the danger of catastrophe has been diminished. The second indicator will be how the global community, Europe, other territorial authorities, and worldwide institutions answers. A believable, confirmable track that obtains broad-based support can transform a break into momentum. The third indicator will be internal political dynamics in the key capitals. In Washington, the White House and Congress will examine whether a cooling coordinates with the wider political terrain, including perspectives within the defense establishment and the intelligence community. In Tehran, extremists and realists will challenge the terms of any agreement. While the economy and public sentiment answer to the degree of respite that actions provide in Moscow, Riyadh, and beyond, the indication will be whether they evaluate the equilibrium of advantages, steadiness, advantage, and sway as favorable enough to persist engaging in this method. Of course, the smartest observers will challenge oversimplified explanations. The account that a single participant established the terms and a single device released cooling seldom captures the truth. The week's results are the outcome of a systemic bargained process where various capitals examine the limits of acceptable danger, while internal voices resist against any perceived surrender. It is attractive to pursue a single offender or a single trigger, but the circumstance is a complex set of motivations and limitations. Each participant computed what would occur if the other advanced first, what would be interpreted as vulnerability or determination, and how to maintain options for future bargaining. That is how authority functions in a reality where crises can be handled, but not dominated by one decision-maker or one nation alone. For audiences observing with an attention toward responsibility, the inquiry stays. Are the public instances coordinated with private guarantees? Will the bargain terms endure the glare of follow-up examination? Will confirmation actions be substantial enough to avert a relapse? And will there be a believable mechanism to address violations without reigniting a wider clash? The danger of a reversal is genuine, but so is the potential for a more steady rules-based participation that diminishes the chance of miscalculation. If the participants handle to transform this break into a longer-term, confirmable structure, it would mark a meaningful, albeit modest accomplishment in a notoriously stubborn domain of global politics. In ending, let us return to the central inquiries that should direct our comprehension of this week's progress. What precisely occurred behind the scenes to derail the trajectory toward renewed confrontation? Why did Russia and the Gulf states select to invest political resources in this particular result? What motivations designed the United States' choice to retreat from the edge? And how will Tehran interpret the indications from the White House, the Pentagon, and its own internal political terrain? The responses lie not in dramatic accounts, but in the careful, systematic examination of policy selections, strategic motivations, and the transforming equilibrium of authority that makes diplomacy both necessary and feasible. The abrupt cooling is not a final triumph or a definitive settlement. It is a break that presents an opening. The genuine examination will be whether those who established the greater space for conversation can now channel it into lasting constructive participation that diminishes danger for millions of people, stabilizes an unstable territory, and maintains the feasibility of future collaboration in sectors where collaboration is not just advantageous but fundamental. As we look forward, the indications are mixed but cautiously optimistic. If the participants stay engaged, if confirmation remains believable, and if territorial participants persist to anchor the process with functional non-sanguinary anxieties in mind, there is space for a trajectory that advances beyond episodic cooling toward a more lasting, if gradual, enhancement in security and steadiness. The following actions will expose whether this episode was an isolated instance of control or the opening chapter of a more realistic multipolar strategy to a dangerous but navigable terrain. The lesson to carry into the weeks and months forward is simple in phrasing but requiring in practice. Control can be productive, but it demands confirmable obligations, believable enforcement, and a shared acknowledgement that steadiness serves concerns larger than any single group or nation. In the conclusion, the inquiry that should direct our reporting stays. Who advantages when conflict withdraws? And what dangers continue if it does not? The response, as this week's developments exhibit, is not a single dramatic disclosure, but a discreet, stubborn acknowledgement. The world's most substantial security matters are progressively handled not solely by strength, but by the careful, frequently invisible effort of diplomacy, supported by a blend of national concerns, territorial authority plays, and the careful reasoning of leaders who comprehend that a break can be more valuable than a triumph if it maintains prospects for a safer future. If we extract one thing from this progress, it should be that cooling is a form of strategic advantage in itself, a space established by careful participants who comprehend that the ultimate objective is not domination in the instance, but durability of peace over duration. The inquiry for observers, policymakers, and citizens alike is whether that lasting peace will be constructed on a foundation strong enough to resist the pressures that will inevitably return. The response will rely on how steadfastly the participants commit to confirmation, how responsibly the external authorities supervise the process, and how patiently the worldwide community maintains a structure that makes danger controllable rather than inviting catastrophe. There is no secured result, but there is a transparent route, an organized, believable, and confirmable process that transforms a rare instance of control into a believable trajectory towards steadiness. That is the genuine examination, and the reality will be observing closely as it materializes.